Hello everyone, I'm Rob, and welcome to this week's episode of MMORPG.com's The List. This week is the 5 worst MMO launches written by David Jagno. MMO launches are one of the trickiest things in the world for a developer and publisher to orchestrate. In the case of single-player games, the experience can be perfectly balanced and simulated in a controlled environment. For standard multiplayer games, you can easily cap the number of players involved and know how it's going to turn out in a live scenario. A massively multiplayer game, on the other hand, is something else entirely. You have hundreds of thousands, perhaps even millions of people from all around the world on different types of hardware, playing at different times, on different service providers, different connection speeds, all trying to play your game at the exact same minute. That's crazy. Thousands of MMOs have existed and do exist in the world right now, so narrowing this list down to just 5 of the worst launches was pretty tough. Number 5. Points Bulletin. Back before Grand Theft Auto created a literal Grand Theft Auto Online experience, Points Bulletin, or APB, tried to be that very thing. In fact, the creator of both the original Grand Theft Auto and Crackdown series, David Jones, was the lead designer on APB. A good sign, right? The pre-release hype was real, and expectations were pretty high around the game leading up to its launch in June of 2010. Fast forward 6 weeks after launch, and the developer, Real Time Worlds, is placed into administration, which basically means life support for struggling businesses. Everything from technical bugs to connectivity issues, gameplay concerns, bad design, and any other problem you can think of were plaguing the game from the start. Just a few weeks later, in September of 2010, the game shut down. It took the world only 3 months to experience, hate, and de-launch an entire game. A feat that is truly remarkable. APB has found a new life since, and is a much improved free-to-play title currently available now. Number 4. Vanguard, Saga of Heroes. Since Vanguard Saga of Heroes no longer exists, it's easy to look back on its life with rose-colored glasses. However, on first glance at launch, it was pretty easy to get Vanguard confused with another big game SOE had a hand in, and that was EverQuest 2. Vanguard had a few things going for it that were different and unique. The entire diplomacy system, in and of itself, was an extremely unique and innovative move forward for the genre as a whole. But that doesn't change the fact that the game's launch was pretty terrible. In a world where World of Warcraft had already existed for nearly 3 years, you can't put out a new AAA MMO that isn't polished and ready for the world to see. Maybe it was the almost complete lack of instancing or zoning, or the ambitious scope of the game at launch, but it just didn't seem finished. Server connectivity or balance issues are one thing, but when the underlying code that your game is built upon is sloppy and messed up, that's something that takes months, or in this case even years, to fix. Anarchy Online. But when you think of a bad launch for an MMO, you usually think of not being able to log in, getting kicked off, losing progress, and other frustrating network issues. In that regard, Anarchy Online is absolutely one of the worst launches ever. It didn't stop there though. People were having issues just subscribing to the game, let alone actually playing it once they had access. Keep in mind, the game launched way back in 2001. During that time, a ton of people were still using dial-up connections, so waiting in a queue often wasn't much of an option for someone. Luckily, the game was able to come back from its rocky start, but the opening few months were truly about as rough as anyone could ever fear an MMO launch could be. And just to put salt in the wound, I included a video that we had on our website for the last few years, which shows an upgrade to Anarchy Online's engine, improving the graphics that they currently use in the Secret World. But again, it's been about 3 years since they told us that we were going to get this, and we still haven't seen it. Number 2. World of Warcraft. The hero in its own tale of true redemption, World of Warcraft fought its way back from a horrid launch to become the most popular and most played MMO in history. But if we flash back 10 years to when the game first launched, and times were quite different. With a company like Blizzard that already knew how popular its properties like Diablo, StarCraft, and Warcraft were for the fanbase, you'd think they could have prepared a bit more for the launch of their biggest game ever. It wasn't just server issues though. Quests were bugged, animations got stuck, and some portions of the game were simply unplayable. In fact, it's worth mentioning that Blizzard has still struggled to learn their lesson. Diablo 3 had a pretty terrible launch. Maybe on the game's 25th anniversary, Blizzard will finally have a grasp on the load that a dedicated fanbase can bring to a game. And the number 1 game with a terrible launch? Final Fantasy XIV. The first time. For me, this was an incredibly easy choice. No other game on this list experienced the perfect storm of horrendous under-delivering on expectations, connection issues, gameplay problems, lack of content, and a billion other problems all at once. The initial launch of Final Fantasy XIV went so terrible in fact that Square Enix even opted to not charge players a subscription fee until it was fixed. Fast forward about a year and they finally started to charge for the game again, although it was still a shadow of what it should have really been. Finally, when version 2.0 actually released, Final Fantasy XIV was a game that players expected and deserved the first time around. Final Fantasy XIV earns the top spot for me, not just because of how horribly the launch went, but because the studio was actually able to improve the game and deliver on its original promises, a feat that only serves to underscore how terrible it was to begin with. Conclusion. I'll be the first to admit that this is far from an exhaustive list. Virtually every MMO in existence has had issues surrounding its launch. It's just a question of their severity and how long the issues persisted before finally being resolved. Also, keep in mind that MMOs are incredibly relative experiences. Just because you had a horrible time trying to log into Guild Wars 2 doesn't mean that as a whole the launch was terrible. Either way, tell us some of your worst launch stories down in the comments below.